Imagine it's the 14th of December, 2001. You're a 43-year-old accountant living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is modest but comfortable. Tile floors, a small balcony overlooking the Palermo neighborhood, a leather sofa you saved up for 2 years to buy. You have a savings account at Banco Nación with the equivalent of 18,000 US dollars in it, which you converted from pesos years ago because your father told you dollars were safe. You have been careful your entire life. You do not gamble. You do not speculate. You have a small collection of gold coins, 4 of them, wrapped in a cloth inside your sock drawer because you read somewhere that gold holds value when everything else falls apart. You are not wealthy, but you're not fragile either. Or so you believe. Your morning routine is the same as always. Coffee at 6, radio on, a quick check of the news. You hear that the government has announced something called a corralito, a restriction on bank withdrawals. You're only allowed to take out 250 pesos per week. You are not immediately panicked. Banks do this, you tell yourself. It will pass. It does not pass. If you have ever wondered why, in every financial crisis in modern history, the people who seemed most prepared ended up losing the most, stay with me. The ones with the savings accounts, the fixed assets, even the gold coins, ended up losing the most, while others with nothing walked away relatively intact. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It is repeated across dozens of countries, dozens of currencies, and dozens of generations. And it always ends the same way. The winners and the losers were not separated by how much they had. They were separated by what they understood. If you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds. And it keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Back to Buenos Aires. Within weeks of that first restriction, the Argentine peso was devalued. Overnight, the government converted dollar-denominated bank deposits into pesos at an unfavorable rate. Your $18,000 became pesos. And then those pesos, because of the devaluation, bought you roughly a third of what they should have. Your 4 gold coins retained their metal value. But they could not pay your rent. They could not buy groceries in a way that kept pace with the chaos in the streets. The supermarkets were being looted. Neighbors were bartering. The infrastructure, utilities, transport, supply chains, was grinding to a halt. Your gold sat in a sock drawer while the world around it stopped functioning. And here's the hard question this video is asking. What is a gold coin worth when the bakery down the street is closed? This video is about what history actually shows us works in a real collapse. Not a correction, not a recession, a genuine societal breakdown. And the answer might surprise you, because it is almost never gold. It is almost never the thing people stockpile in preparation. The historical record points to something more human, more practical, and more counterintuitive than almost anything you will find in a prepper form or a financial survival guide. Before we go further, there's something important to understand about how collapse actually happens. Most people imagine it like a bomb going off. One moment everything is fine, and the next moment it is not. But that is almost never how it works. Collapse is not a bomb. It is a river changing course. It moves slowly at first, barely perceptible, and then all at once. The rot is in the beams, not on the surface. The cracks spread for years before the floor gives way. And because it moves that slowly, most people do not recognize it until they are already standing in the rubble. The economic mechanism behind most collapses follows a predictable sequence. First, there is a period of perceived stability built on debt, either government debt, private debt, or both. Then comes a shock, sometimes external like a commodity crash or a foreign lending freeze, sometimes internal like a bank failure or a political crisis. The government then faces an impossible choice. It can let the system deflate painfully, which destroys wealth and causes unemployment. Or it can inflate, print money, or loosen controls, which destroys the purchasing power of savings. Either way, the middle class tends to lose. The very rich have assets that survive both scenarios. The very poor have nothing to lose. It is the careful, disciplined saver, the person who did everything right, who ends up most exposed. The reason gold fails in these moments is not that gold has no value. It is that gold solves the wrong problem. In a real collapse, the scarcity is not of stored wealth. The scarcity is of functioning systems, food distribution systems, medical supply systems, social trust, human cooperation. You cannot eat gold. You cannot bribe a checkpoint with a coin if the soldier does not recognize the coin's legitimacy. You cannot trade gold at a market that has stopped operating. Gold solves the problem of storing value across decades of normal economic activity. It was never designed to solve the problem of a society losing its connective tissue. This brings us directly to the first major case study in this pattern, and it is one of the most instructive episodes in modern economic history. We go to Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. The story most people know is the wheelbarrow full of banknotes, the image of workers being paid twice a day because by evening the money was worth less than it was in the morning. Prices doubled every 3.5 days at the peak. By November 1923, one US dollar bought 4.2 trillion German marks. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not millions, not billions, trillions. The entire savings of the German middle class was functionally destroyed. But here is what most people do not know about Weimar. The people who had gold did not automatically survive. Some did, some did not. The determining factor was not possession of the gold itself, it was what you could do with it and who you knew. In the cities, gold coins were useful mainly in the black market, an informal illegal trading network that sprang up almost immediately as the official economy collapsed. If you had gold but no access to the black market, no relationships with farmers or black market traders, no knowledge of how to navigate that world, your gold sat idle, while others with relationships, with social capital, with practical skills, with local trust, actually managed to eat. A carpenter who could fix a farmer's barn ate better than a banker who had a box of coins. A midwife who delivered babies in exchange for food from rural families survived better than a retired civil servant with savings that evaporated overnight. The sociologist and historian Alexander Elster documented at the time that in the countryside surrounding major German cities, barter networks formed within weeks. These networks did not run on gold. They ran on skills and relationships. A doctor who moved to a rural village and offered medical services in exchange for lodging and food. A teacher who tutored farmers' children and was fed accordingly. The people who made it through Weimar hyperinflation largely did so through what we might now call community embeddedness. They were connected, they were useful, they were trusted, and that trust was worth more than any commodity in the drawer. This leads to the second part of this story. And to do it justice, we need to travel to a completely different continent, a different century, and a different kind of collapse. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If the collapse came tomorrow and your bank account was frozen, not just reduced, actually frozen, inaccessible, as happened in Argentina in 2001 and Cyprus in 2013, what would you have that your neighbors would actually need? Not what would you have stored? What would you have that creates value for another human being? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. The second case study is Lebanon, beginning in 2019. This is not ancient history. This is the present tense for millions of people still living it. In October 2019, Lebanon's financial system began to implode. It was the result of a Ponzi-style arrangement between the central bank, the commercial banks, and the government. This means a scheme where early investors are paid using money from new investors, not from actual profits. The Banque du Liban, Lebanon's central bank, had been offering commercial banks extraordinarily high interest rates to attract dollar deposits, then using those dollars to finance government spending. The whole structure required a constant inflow of new deposits to pay the old ones. When that inflow slowed, the structure collapsed. Within months, banks froze deposits. Lebanese citizens, who had spent decades saving dollars in accounts they believed were safe, found those dollars inaccessible. Informal capital controls, restrictions on moving or withdrawing money, were imposed without any legal framework, meaning there was no official rule saying you could not withdraw your money, but if you went to the bank, you simply could not. By 2021, the Lebanese pound had lost more than 90% of its value. Inflation exceeded 200% annually. The electricity grid was running on an average of 2 to 4 hours per day in major cities, including Beirut. Hospitals ran out of medicine and fuel for generators. Now here is the crucial data point. In surveys conducted by research groups including the Assam Fairs Institute at the American University of Beirut, the households that reported the highest resilience during this period shared specific characteristics. They were not the ones with the most gold. They were the ones with access to agricultural land, with family networks that spanned rural and urban areas, and with skills that were in direct demand. Mechanics, medical workers, electricians, farmers. The Lebanese diaspora living abroad who could send remittances in foreign currency became a lifeline. Domestically, the people who fared best were those embedded in functioning local economies that operated outside the formal financial system. An important counterintuitive fact emerged from Lebanon. Those who held gold jewelry found that selling or pawning it was useful in the short term. But the proceeds, once converted to Lebanese pounds, evaporated in weeks due to inflation. Gold bought you time. It did not buy you survival. Now here is where it gets interesting. To complete the picture, we need to look at a third case. We go to the Soviet Union, collapsing between 1989 and 1991. The Soviet collapse was not a standard financial crisis. It was the dissolution of an entire economic and political system. 40% of household savings were wiped out. The ruble lost catastrophic value. State enterprises stopped functioning. Pensions became nearly worthless. Savings in the Soviet state banking system became functionally meaningless. The single most important factor in household survival, Was access to a dacha and informal network density? How many people you knew personally who you could exchange favors with? People with wide, deep networks of mutual obligation survived at higher rates. People who were socially isolated suffered the most because they lacked the social infrastructure that money normally buys. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, assuming the structures they rely on are permanent simply because they have always been there. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all three of these cases have in common. Weimar Germany, Lebanon 2019, the Soviet collapse of 1991, 3 different countries, 3 different centuries, 3 different causes of collapse. The same underlying mechanism every single time. When formal systems fail, survival is determined not by what you have stored, but by what you can produce, what you can exchange, and who trusts you. In Weimar, it was skills and black market relationships. In Lebanon, it was agricultural access and diaspora networks. In Soviet Russia, it was land plots and informal neighbor networks. The gold holders in each case did not uniformly suffer. Some did well. But the gold alone was not the variable. The variable was always human capital, social capital, and productive capacity. Think of formal economic systems as the scaffolding around a building under construction. While the scaffolding is up, it supports everything. You can reach any floor, you can move freely, but the scaffolding is not the building. If the scaffolding falls, what keeps the floors in place is the structure of the building itself, the materials, the connections between beams, the load-bearing walls. In a real collapse, the formal economy's scaffolding falls away. What remains is the real structure of human cooperation. And that structure is built from skills, relationships, land, and trust. Gold sits in a sock drawer. It is not load-bearing. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. But before we talk about who walks away fine and who gets destroyed, let us be very precise about the specific groups of people that history shows suffer most. Because the data here is striking and specific, and almost nobody talks about it. The first and most vulnerable group is always middle-class savers. Not the poor, not the rich, the middle-class savers. The reason is structural. The poor have very little to lose in financial terms, and they typically already have informal survival networks because they have always had to rely on them. The poor in Argentina in 2001 were already operating in informal economies. They knew how to barter. They knew how to cooperate without money. They had been doing it for years out of necessity. The wealthy, meanwhile, have assets that cross collapse. Land, foreign accounts, hard business assets, political connections. They lose value in a collapse, but they rarely lose everything. The middle-class saver is the one most exposed. They have enough savings to feel secure, but those savings are held in the formal financial system. Bank accounts, pension funds, government bonds. When the formal system fails or is restructured, those are the assets that take the greatest hits. In Argentina's 2001 corralito and subsequent pacification, the forced conversion of dollar accounts into pesos, middle-class savers with dollar deposits lost an estimated 60 to 70% of their effective purchasing power in a matter of weeks. Working-class Argentines with informal cash earnings outside the banking system were not directly hit in the same way. The second group that consistently suffers is pensioners and retirees. In every case study in this video, pension systems were early casualties. In Weimar Germany, state pensions were effectively destroyed by hyperinflation. In the Soviet collapse, pensions became functionally worthless within 18 months. In Argentina, pension fund assets were eventually confiscated by the government through a 2008 nationalization, years after the 2001 crisis. In Lebanon, the pensions of civil servants became nearly meaningless as the pound collapsed. The pattern is ruthless and consistent. Defined pension payments, which means payments set at a fixed amount rather than tied to an inflation index, are the first casualty because they are easiest for governments to erode through inflation or currency manipulation without technically defaulting. The third group is small business owners who are dependent on supply chains or credit. In Zimbabwe, during the hyperinflation period that peaked around 2008, when the inflation rate at its worst was estimated at several billion% per month, small business owners who held stock, imported goods, or relied on bank credit were devastated first because they needed functioning systems, predictable prices, reliable suppliers, access to working capital, and those systems vanished. The traders who survived were the ones who moved to barter quickly, who held hard foreign currency illegally if necessary, or who pivoted to supplying goods that were in structural shortage, food, fuel, medicine, not because they were smarter necessarily, because they happened to be positioned in the right part of the collapsed economy. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Now let us talk about the survivors. What did they actually do? What did they have in common that the historical record can actually point to with confidence? The historical record shows that those who came through these periods relatively intact largely shared four characteristics. Not assets, characteristics. The first was productive redundancy, which means they had more than one way to generate value for others. They were not dependent on a single job, a single income stream, or a single skill. In Weimar Germany, accounts from the period describe tradespeople who could also grow food, or food producers who could also repair tools. In the Soviet collapse, engineers who had grown up with parents who farmed and maintained those skills were in a dramatically different position. In Lebanon, the families who weathered the crisis best were often those where at least one member had a practical skill outside the formal economy. The second characteristic was low formal system dependency. The survivors tended to carry as little wealth as possible in instruments entirely dependent on institutional health, which means they did not have everything in savings accounts. This is not the same as saying they held gold instead. It means they held a broader range of real assets, productive land, tools, relationships, and skills. Their financial footprint in the formal system was deliberately modest relative to their overall security. The third characteristic was geographic access to primary production. Almost universally, across every case study, people with some connection to food production fared better, not because they personally farmed full-time, but because they had a pathway into food supply that did not run through formal distribution chains. The dacha gardens of post-Soviet Russia, the village family contacts of Lebanese city dwellers, the relationship with a rural cousin that an Argentine professional maintained. These connections, which seemed sentimental or nostalgic in normal times, became load-bearing infrastructure in crisis. The fourth characteristic was social reputation and community trust. This is the hardest to quantify and the most commonly overlooked, but in every case study, the people who were trusted by their immediate community had access to informal networks that excluded strangers. In collapsed economies, information and access flow through trust networks. Knowing which black market is safe, knowing which barter partner will not cheat you, knowing who has medicine or fuel. These networks are invisible in normal times. In crisis, they are the difference between eating and not eating. Notice that gold appears nowhere in that list, not because gold is useless, but because gold is a secondary instrument. It is useful for converting wealth from one period of stability to another across the gap of a collapse. It has genuine historical utility in that narrow function. But it requires a functioning market on the other side of the gap to realize that utility. If you emerge from a collapse with gold coins, but no skills, no relationships, no community trust, and no access to food supply, the coin has no takers. We should also address the specific case of Cyprus in 2013 because it illustrates a mechanism that most people believe cannot happen to them. In March 2013, Cyprus's banking system collapsed after its banks had made enormous bets on Greek government debt. The European Union provided a bailout. Depositors with more than 100,000 euros in Cypriot banks would have a portion of those deposits seized to help fund the rescue. This is called a bail-in, which means, unlike a bailout where the government injects money, a bail-in takes money from the depositors inside the bank. Large depositors lost an estimated 47.5%. It happened without warning, over a weekend. The Cypriots who suffered least were those who had moved capital outside, or those who had productive assets on the island. The pattern holds again. Institutional vulnerability is the real risk. Gold is a hedge against inflation. It is not a hedge against institutional failure if you cannot use it during the failure. Now we return to Buenos Aires, to the accountant on the balcony. What happened to him? It depended on what he did in the weeks immediately before and after the Corralito. If he had relatives who could receive him, he likely made it through. If he was purely an urban professional with no informal networks, he faced a harder road. His gold coins bought him time. By 2002, Argentina began to stabilize. The survivors cited not their stored assets, but their social networks as the primary factor. Wealth is not storage. Wealth is capacity. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified financial professional. Share this video with a friend. Subscribe for more economic history. I will see you in the next one.